full moon. Something was wrong. The thought immediately shot through Bibi's mind as she bolted up, but she was still so sleepy that for a fleeting moment, she didn't even know if she was actually awake. Then she heard the neighing. "Sabrina?" she muttered. No, the neighing wasn't coming from the stable. It was a loud, wild sound, accompanied by hoofbeats. "Geronimo!" Suddenly, Bibi was wide awake. She struggled out of her sleeping bag and rushed to the gable window. The moon lit up the night like a giant lantern. She leaned far out, but could only see a small part of the paddock from the hayloft. Again, she heard Geronimo's neighing. Something was going on out there, and not something good. But Bibi couldn't see it. She had to get out. The next moment, she shook Tina. "Quick, get up!" "What is it?" muttered Tina. "There's something wrong with Geronimo." Now Tina could hear the neighing and stomping from outside. "What?" In one move, she shot up out of bed. Luckily, the two girls had slept in their clothes, so they wouldn't lose time in an emergency. Tina grabbed the flashlight and the two girls raced down the ladder and out the stable door. Out of breath from the hustle, they reached the gate of the paddock. Now it was clear why Geronimo was neighing. Someone was sitting on his back. But the girls could not recognize his face. Was it a thief? Then he had certainly chosen the wrong horse, for Geronimo fought back with all his might. Bibi and Tina had only seen something like this in an old Western show on television, where the stallion leaps with all fours in the air at once, arching his back like a cat and using all means necessary to throw the rider off. But the Mustang was without success. As a horse thief, the man might be a failure, but boy could he ride. Geronimo galloped off and then stopped abruptly, but the rider was prepared for that as well. At just the right moment, he leaned back to avoid being thrown over Geronimo's head. The black horse whinnied angrily and spun in circles several times at breakneck speed, the moonlight illuminating the rider's face with a soft glow. "That's—" Bibi couldn't believe it. "Alex!" cried Tina, her voice mixed with anger and surprise. When the rider heard her, he looked up. He lost concentration for a second, and that was enough. Geronimo made a huge leap to the side, and Alex flew off his back in a high arc. "Alex!" cried Tina again, but this time her voice was full of fear and concern. "Alex!" In one bound, she swung over the fence and ran to him. "Alex!" She shook his shoulder. "Did something happen to you? Are you in pain?" Alex raised his head and groaned. "No, it's okay," he mumbled groggily. At once, a piercing animal cry rang across the farm, and all three looked at Geronimo. He reared up and broke into a gallop with thundering hooves, flying over the paddock fence with a tremendous leap before disappearing into the night. "Quick!" cried Alex, who had already picked himself up again. "After him!" Bibi and Tina ran to the stable. While they were still running, Bibi said, "Eeny, meeny, stampede cattle, ready our horses, bridle and saddle, whiz, whiz!" A pling-pling echoed from the paddock, and witches' stars sparkled before them as they stormed into the stable. Amadeus and Sabrina awaited them, excited and snorting. The girls mounted immediately and blew across the yard. At the gate, Alex was already waiting for them on Maharaja. The three of them chased down the dirt road where Geronimo had fled. The path led directly into Falkenstein forest, at the edge of which they had to restrain their horses. To look for a horse in the forest at night, that was not an easy task. "Oh, man," Alex moaned desperately. "This is all my fault." "We'll talk about that later," Tina shook her head. "Now we have to find Geronimo." "But how?" said Alex. Bibi had an idea. She stretched out her arms and sang, "Eeny, meeny, hooves aglow, reveal to us Geronimo! Whiz, whiz!" Like a string of lights, a trail appeared before them on the forest floor. Without hesitation, they followed it as fast as they could. After what seemed like ages, the path illuminated even more, leading them once again to the edge of the forest. In front of them was the road which the friends cantered along until they reached the meadow with the old oak. Sabrina snorted excitedly. Under the big old tree stood Geronimo. "Oh, my sweetie," Bibi calmed her mare. Geronimo stepped out onto the meadow and began to graze. The 3 night travelers steadied their horses. For a while, none of them said anything. The sprawling old tree and the black Mustang against the silver light of the moon. The picture was just too beautiful. Finally, Bibi got out of the saddle. "I'm going to him," she declared determinedly. "Can't you just tame him with magic or something?" Tina asked. "I could do that," replied Bibi, "but I don't want to." "And why not?" Tina asked. "Well," Bibi hesitated, "I just want it to work without magic. I want Geronimo to trust me." Tina sighed. "But how, Bibi?" "I don't know exactly, but I have an idea." Tina shrugged her shoulders. "Please, be careful." "Don't worry, I can still use magic if I have to." Bibi left Sabrina with Tina and Alex and went off. They also dismounted, looking after Bibi with nervous interest. "Where's she going?" wondered Alex. Bibi did not walk towards Geronimo, but instead straight towards the old oak tree. There she sat down and leaned against the trunk. Alex wondered, "I thought Bibi wanted to catch him, but she does nothing at all." "Bibi knows what she's doing," Tina replied confidently. She looked at her friend, who could hardly be seen under the old oak tree, and then over to Geronimo. The stallion was still grazing not far away from the tree. For seemingly endless minutes, nothing happened at all. Tina and Alex decided to sit down. As the grass was quite wet, Alex unsaddled Maharaja and spread the saddlecloth on the ground. He and Tina sat beside each other. The soft moonlight across the meadow spread a peaceful mood. "Tell me, Alex, what was that all about before? Were you trying to kidnap Geronimo?" Tina finally asked after they had been sitting in silence for quite a while. "No, of course not." Alex took off his jacket and put it around Tina's shoulders to keep her warm. "Well then?" "Well, I wanted to ride him." "You wanted to ride him?" Tina repeated in a skeptical voice. "Why?" Well, Alex stalled. "Mustangs have to be broken in, don't they?" "Yes, but not necessarily by you, and in the middle of the night?" "Well," Alex hesitated again. Suddenly, he reached out his arm in excitement. "Look, Tina!" Tina looked up. Geronimo was walking towards the old oak. Bibi remained silent. Geronimo stopped again and grazed on as if nothing had happened. "Well, what was it like?" Tina poked Alex with her elbow. "You were about to explain something to me." It's not so easy," Alex stuttered. Again, he remained silent for a while, as if he had to take a long run-up to explain it. Finally, he said, "I wanted to ride Geronimo so you'd like me again and not think I'm a wimp." He exhaled noisily. There, it was out. "Pardon me?" Tina still didn't understand. "You wanted to ride him so I'd like you again and not think you were a wimp?" she repeated. Alex nodded. Suddenly, the words gushed out of him. "Freddie told me I was a sissy with no guts, and you got along so well with him all the time, so I thought that maybe you thought I was a wimp too, and that you were falling in love with Freddie, so I wanted to prove to you that I wasn't a wimp, and then I had this idea to ride Geronimo, and I thought—" Tina's face flushed with love for Alex. "Really? Really, Alex? You did that just for me?" "Sure, I did. I was so desperate to make up with you, and I just didn't know how. Then I got this idea, and I realized now that it was totally crazy, but I couldn't help it." "Yes, Alex, that was really totally crazy," Tina said in a soft voice. She took a break and moved closer to him. "But I also think it's really sweet that you're doing something crazy because of me. You know, I thought that you didn't like me anymore either." "What? Why?" Now it was Alex's turn to wonder. "Well, I was so looking forward to spending the holidays with you and Bibi. Then some stupid storm comes and ruins your stupid garage, and suddenly you have no time at all." Alex nodded. "You're right, Tina. But you know my father. It's not exactly easy to deny him something. I just didn't know what to do. I'm sorry." Tina also nodded. With Count Falkhoff and Falkenstein, It wasn't always easy to get him to see a different perspective. This she knew all too well. At the same time, Tina realized that she herself had behaved rather nastily. She had simply ignored Alex, and she had actually flirted a bit with Freddie, just to make Alex jealous. Tina put her head on Alex's shoulder. "I'm sorry too, Alex," she said softly. "Can we make up?" "Yes." Alex lit up. A heavy weight was lifted off his chest, and a newfound lightness took hold of his heart. He put his arm around Tina's shoulders and gently pulled her close. They sat there in silence, both relieved that their quarrel was finally over. All of a sudden, Tina straightened upright. "Alex," she cried, "look!" The black stallion had set himself in motion again. He came even closer to the oak tree where Bibi patiently waited. Now he was right in front of her. Geronimo snorted excitedly and slowly lowered his head. Bibi gently stretched out her hand. Her fingertips touched Geronimo's velvety soft horse nose. This time, he didn't back away. He let her stroke him. Warm breath came out of his nostrils. After a while, Bibi stood up carefully and scratched him between the ears. Geronimo nudged her confidently on the shoulder. "Well, my dear friend," said Bibi, patting his neck, "shall we go back to Martin's farm?" Geronimo whinnied loudly. "Come on then," said Bibi. She walked slowly and the horse followed her. Tina and Alex could hardly believe what they saw. As Bibi came towards them, Geronimo followed behind her like a faithful dog. Suddenly, he pushed her playfully from behind. "What's up?" Bibi turned around, laughing. Geronimo whinnied again, raising and lowering his head several times. "Hey, you want to play with me?" Bibi was overwhelmed with happiness. Geronimo had gained confidence in her. A totally crazy thought came to her. Could she ride him? Should she try? Or would she destroy everything again? Bibi stepped next to Geronimo and patted his neck. "Whoa, easy," she said to him. Geronimo stood there calmly. Bibi reached into his mane and without a moment's hesitation, pushed herself off the ground and swung onto his back. Geronimo still stood there motionless. Alex and Tina, who had followed everything with eyes glued open, hardly dared to breathe. Bibi straightened up. "Go, Geronimo," she said as calmly as possible. Gently but firmly, she pressed her lower legs against Geronimo's flanks, and the Mustang began to move. At first, it just trotted along slowly, but he understood Bibi's commands perfectly and seemed to enjoy following them. Finally, Bibi bent slightly forward and increased the pressure on her lower legs. "Giddy up, Geronimo," she said in a loud voice. Tina and Alex were terrified when the black horse suddenly galloped off. "Oh no, he's going too fast," cried Tina excitedly. Alex shook his head. No, Tina," he said, hardly believing himself. "Bibi has him in her grip." It was true. Geronimo galloped across the meadow in the moonlight with Bibi on his back, her blonde ponytail waving behind her. Tina and Alex jumped up. They watched intently as Bibi galloped out into the night on Geronimo. Tina was worried about her friend, and only when Bibi came back after some time could she let out a big sigh of relief. Galloping on the jet-black stallion, the little witch blasted right up to where Alex and Tina were cuddling, bringing the snorting Geronimo to a halt. "Now we're riding back to Martin's farm," she laughed. "Yes," beamed Tina. "Let's do it." Alex saddled Maharaja again. As he wanted to return to the castle, he said goodbye to Tina with a long embrace. "Well, I can't come tomorrow," Alex said softly, "but I'll see you as soon as possible, okay? You will?" Tina looked up at him and smiled. "As soon as possible." Then Alex jumped up in the saddle. "Goodbye, Bibi," he cried out, galloping into the night. Bibi and Tina trotted back to Martin's farm. This time, they didn't take the path through the forest, but over the fields. Tina led Sabrina on the reins while Bibi rode Geronimo. When they reached Martin's farm, Bibi brought Geronimo back to the paddock, while Tina led Sabrina and Amadeus into the stable and unhitched them. When Bibi came into the stable shortly afterwards, she cuddled up with Sabrina for quite a while, whispering to her not to be jealous. Finally, the friends were laying next to each other again in the hayloft, snuggled up in their cozy sleeping bags. The flashlight spread a dim light. "Well," said Bibi, smiling, "so you made up again, you two lovebirds. Or am I mistaken?" "No," Tina exhaled slowly. "We did. Just think. Alex was riding Geronimo to prove to me how much he liked me." "Really?" Bibi shook her head. "I didn't think he could do something so crazy." "Yeah, it was crazy," Tina giggled happily. "But when you love someone that much, you sometimes do crazy stuff." She didn't say anything for quite a while. "But then there was the full moon," she added. "He was looking at the moon, and then he had this idea, he told me." "And I thought the full moon only worked on witches and wild animals," Bibi smiled. "It certainly worked on you and Geronimo," Tina replied. "Or, how did you do that? That Geronimo let you ride him. That was pretty crazy too." "It was," said Bibi. "Totally crazy. And beautiful. I still can't believe it." The two friends lay there for a while in the nighttime silence, each one sinking deeper into their own memories of one totally crazy full moon night. Finally, Tina turned to her friend and said, "Okay, it's time to sleep. We have to get up early." She turned off the flashlight, and shortly after that, both friends were sound asleep. A man-to-man conversation. Alex hadn't slept very long when the alarm clock rang. It was only 6 a.m. With a gaping yawn, he peeled out from under the covers and sat up on the edge of the bed, stretching his arms above his head to wake up. He remembered the night before. My goodness, he thought. Had he actually tried to ride Geronimo? Did that really happen? Or had he only dreamed it? But when Alex got up to go to the bathroom, all his bones hurt. That was proof enough. He really had fallen off the horse. He was thinking about the night's events. Yes, he and Tina had made up. Alex smiled. That's good. Tina wasn't angry with him anymore. Now vacation could really start. But there was something else, something weighing on his mind. The roof work, of course. That's why he'd set the alarm so early. The more he thought about the roof, the angrier he got. He didn't want to work. He wanted to spend the day with his girlfriend Tina, Bibi, and the horses. It was only now that he truly realized that. Instead, he was supposed to supervise roofers, and for a whole week at that. It was unfair. And to whom did he owe this inconvenience? His father. Without asking, Count Falco von Falkenstein had simply decided for his son, "You're on vacation now and have nothing better to do anyway." Those had been his words, and Alex had, as usual, only nodded and said, "Yes, father." But he had really earned this vacation. Every day after school, he worked on math until his brain had turned to mush. He'd hardly ridden Maharaja anymore, and he'd hardly seen Tina either, so it wasn't true that he had nothing better to do. Now he understood why Tina had been so angry with him. He really let his father decide all his plans. After he brushed his teeth, his anger subsided, but Alex still felt helpless and confused. What should he do now? Do what his father wanted him to do? Like always? No, he simply couldn't do that anymore. But what then? He had to stand up for himself. Suddenly, Alex remembered last night and how he had tried to ride Geronimo. It had been risky, but also unbelievably exciting. Even though Geronimo had thrown him off, he had held on bravely, he thought, and in the end, his crazy stunt had even had a good side. He and Tina had reconciled again. "Well," muttered Alex, "nothing ventured, nothing gained." That was another one of those sayings he sometimes heard from his father. "Nothing ventured, nothing gained," Alex repeated thoughtfully. Resolute, he now knew what he had to do. Of course, he would talk to his father. After all, he had offered that himself last night, and now he actually had something on his mind that he wanted to tell his father, even if he would certainly not be too pleased about it. Quite the opposite, he figured. Alex felt his heart beat faster with nervous excitement. He had, after all, been sitting on a wild Mustang last night. In comparison, a conversation with his father was a small thing, wasn't it? Alex nodded to himself in the mirror to reassure himself. Then he got dressed and marched out of the room with confidence. Count Falco von Falkenstein was an early riser by conviction. "The early bird catches the worm," he used to say with a reproachful undertone if Alex slept in longer than 8 o'clock. But of course the Count didn't get up that early to catch worms. Instead, he loved to read several daily newspapers at length, occasionally sipping a cup of Earl Grey while taking bites of toast with orange marmalade. When Alex came in with a "Good morning, father," the Count took off his monocle and eyed him over the edge of the newspaper. "Good morning, my son." Alex decided to come straight to the point. "I wanted to talk to you about something, father. I've thought it over, and I've decided—" He tried to suppress a sudden lump in his throat, but there was no turning back. "I beg your pardon? Made a decision?" Count Falco von Falkenstein's left eyebrow rose slowly. He was distinctly irritated. "Since when does my son make arbitrary decisions, if one may ask?" "Since today, father," Alex replied firmly. "I must speak to you about a certain matter, man to man, so to speak." Isn't that what Freddie had said yesterday? Alex now found the phrase very fitting. "Is that so? About a certain matter?" the Count repeated with a yawn before stretching and sipping his tea. "Man to man." He carefully folded the newspaper and laid it down beside him. "Perhaps you should sit down first, my boy," he continued. "If you did not dine with me last night, we should at least have breakfast together." "Yes, of course, father. Good idea." Alex managed to ignore the Count's reproachful tone. He took a chair and sat down. Since he hadn't eaten anything last night, he felt ready to devour everything in the entire castle kitchen. The Count rang the bell, and butler Ethelbert hastily brought another place setting. He poured Alex a cup of cocoa. "You may retire for the time being, Ethelbert," the Count decided. "My son and I have something we wish to discuss. Man to man." "Very well, Your Grace." After a measured bow and barely perceptible amused twitch at the corners of his mouth, Ethelbert left the room. The Count bent forward a little. "Well, Alexander, what is it?" "I'm all ears," he said, and put his monocle back in front of his eye. Alex slipped uneasily back and forth in his chair. "It's about the roof work, father," he finally replied. He explained to his father how diligently he had been preparing for school lately, and how much he had been looking forward to vacation and seeing Tina, and how she was disappointed yesterday that he had no time for her. The Count had listened without a word up until this point. "Aha! So the wind blows," he interrupted Alex and raised his index finger. "Tina Martin will calm down again, my son. As a future heir to the castle, you must above all learn to set your own priorities and fulfill your obligations to tradition." Alex had expected his father to say something like that. "I agree with you, father," he replied. "There you go." The Count, who thought the matter was then settled, reached for his newspaper again and began to unfold it. But Alex continued in a decisive tone. "I agree with you, that as future lord of the castle, I must learn to set my own priorities, father, but I can only do that if you are not continually deciding for me what I should and should not do." That was more than clear. The Count's face suddenly changed color. He put the paper aside without even bothering to fold it back up. "Pardon me? How dare you talk to your father that way, Alexander? I won't stand for this. I will not be spoken to in that manner." He bent over and glanced angrily at Alex, and then it happened. Splat! Alex had to summon all his self-control not to burst out laughing. The Count's monocle had fallen into his cup of Earl Grey, sinking to the bottom like a leaking battleship after the fight and splashing onto his face and coat collar. The Count's gaze shifted crossly between his son and the teacup, confused as to which problem he should deal with first, the recovery of the lost monocle or the taming of his unruly son. The former seemed easier to solve, so he fished the monocle out of the cup with tweezer-like fingers. "Here you are, father." Alex immediately handed him his unused bright white napkin. Count Falco took it without even looking at his son and laboriously dried his fingertips. He cleaned his monocle, pinched it between his eyelids, and dabbed the tea splashes on his jacket. When he was finished, he seemed to have calmed down a bit. Alex now continued in a conciliatory voice. "I understand, father, that the condition of Falkenstein Castle is close to your heart, and I feel the same way as you do." The Count tried to adopt a somewhat dignified attitude, which was not easy after his clumsy mishap. "At least I'm glad to hear that," he announced reservedly. "But Alex continued resolutely. During the vacation, I would also like to spend time with Bibi, Tina, and the horses. That is also very important to me, so I suggest that we take turns doing the roofing. One day me, one day you. I can't do it today, but I'll be there tomorrow. You can count on it. Well, well, tomorrow you'll be there, repeated the Count, lost in thought. Then he said nothing for a while. A soft smile began to play around the corners of his mouth, for he suddenly remembered how he himself had had a similar conversation with his father many years ago. And he had to admit, Alexander had a point. As a future Count, he really had to learn how to make his own decisions. The Counts of Falkenstein had always been independent personalities. This had begun with the founder of the castle, Leo von Falkenstein. All his descendants, each in his own way, had been unique, unmistakable, sometimes even a bit eccentric. But all of them had preserved their heritage and family tradition to this day. Falkenstein Castle and the surrounding estates had not been damaged in the last 750 years. Count Falco von Falkenstein understood that he had to allow Alexander to find his own way, just as his father had allowed him to do. He looked benevolently at his son. "Alexander," he said with emotion in his voice, "I am proud of you." Alex had just taken a sip of cocoa. Surprised at his father's sudden change of heart, he almost snorted it back through his nose. What?" he stammered. "Yes, I am. We Falkensteins have always had a habit of acting according to our own priorities. That's also a, old family tradition." The Count cleared his throat. "In any case, Alexander, I am willing to accept your proposal, but only on one condition," Alex inquired cautiously. "On what condition?" "I want you to be by my side when the workmen come and will inspect the future site." Count Falco von Falkenstein leaned forward and reached out to his son. "Deal?" he asked. Man to man?" Alex took his father's hand and shook it enthusiastically. "It's a deal, and thank you, Father." Alex felt immense relief as the Count once again returned to his newspaper. Had Alex been able to look through it, he would have seen that a slight smile lit up across Count Falco von Falkenstein's face. Mr. Brown. A thick morning mist still hung over Martin's farm, and though Hubert the rooster let out a long, almighty crow, Bibi and Tina slept right on through it. Only when the sun was already high in the sky did Tina finally open her eyes. A straw had tickled her nose, and she had to sneeze so hard that Bibi jolted up out of her sleeping bag. Now they were both wide awake, and an exciting morning was waiting for them. Today, Mr. Brown would come and pick up Geronimo. Hopefully, Geronimo would find a home with him where he felt comfortable, Bibi mused, but the rumbling of her stomach interrupted her thoughts. At almost the same moment, Tina's stomach also began growling. After they had packed everything up and washed themselves, they went into the kitchen. Mrs. Martin had already eaten breakfast and was sitting at the table going through her daily schedule. "Good morning, Mama," Tina greeted her mother. "Good morning. Well, how did you sleep?" Fine, Mummy," Tina hesitated. "Quite good." Did her mother know anything about what happened that night? Bibi and Tina had decided to keep it to themselves. One could not necessarily expect adults to understand such nocturnal adventures. "Wasn't it too cold in the barn?" Mrs. Martin inquired anxiously as she began to make a shopping list. "No, Mom, not at all." Tina gave Bibi a conspiratorial wink. Her mother hadn't noticed anything. Lucky them. After the girls had had breakfast, they went to the paddock to check on Geronimo. They had barely closed the front door behind them when an engine came roaring towards the front gate. Bibi poked her friend mischievously in the side with her elbow. "Your new flame, Tina." Pfft, Tina shook her head, faking exasperation. "Very funny, Bibi. Not a word to Freddie about last night. This is between you, me, and Alex." "Sure." Bibi felt the same. Freddie dashed through the gate on his little machine. "Morning, girls," he shouted happily and turned off the engine. "Is Geronimo still here, or has he escaped again?" "That's where we were about to go," Tina replied. "You can come along and have a look." Freddie took off his helmet. "I will. I'm just curious how Mr. Brown will get him in the trailer later. I wouldn't miss it for the world." The three of them marched to the paddock. When Geronimo saw them coming, he whinged and trotted to the gate. Hey, what's wrong with him? Freddie wondered. Instead of answering, Bibi reached into her trouser pockets and took out a horse treat. Geronimo took it with his soft nostrils and crunched it. Man, you have him eating out of your hand, Bibi. Freddie couldn't believe it. Did you put a spell on him or what? No, I didn't, Bibi shook her head. Freddie looked at her skeptically. But how did you do it? Suddenly he's as tame as a lamb. Well, said Bibi mysteriously, there's a certain connection between witches and wild horses, you see. It's hard to explain. A certain connection? Freddie was quite confused. Yes, Bibi nodded seriously. My Aunt Mania would say it's the elemental forces of nature that work within us. The primal forces of nature? Freddie looked at her with disbelief. Well, if you say so. At that moment, they heard the sound of another engine. Was that Mr. Brown? They ran back. A truck with a horse trailer pulled into the yard and stopped in front of them. A tall, slim man got out. He was wearing a checkered flannel shirt, jeans and cowboy boots, and you could see at first glance that he was used to being around horses. He had dusty brown hair and a suntanned face with bright green eyes. The three children immediately liked him. Good morning, he greeted them. Is this the right place? If you are Mr. Brown, then yes, Tina replied. That's me, Tom Brown, but you can call me Tom. He smiled warmly. And what are your names? Bibi, Tina, and Freddie introduced themselves, and now Mrs. Martin came out of the house too. Hello, Mr. Brown. How nice that you have found your way here. Tom Brown shook her hand warmly. That was no problem. And you must be Mrs. Martin, he asked. The one who worked the miracle of capturing my Geronimo? Tina's mother shook her head, smiling. No, that wasn't me. It was Tina, Bibi, and Freddie. She pointed to the three children. And Alex, Tina added. He can't come today. He's busy. I see. Mr. Brown looked at the three children and smiled. You must tell me later how you did it. But first, I want to see Geronimo. As they reached the paddock, Geronimo trotted over to the gate. Mr. Brown shone like a schoolboy. Geronimo! He shouted enthusiastically. There you are again, my runaway! Geronimo whinnied in high spirits. He let himself be stroked and rubbed his nostrils confidently on Mr. Brown's shoulder. Tom Brown had a way with horses. You could see that at first sight. Mrs. Martin had noticed that too. Geronimo likes you, she said with a smile. He won't let us anywhere near him. He does with me, Bibi objected. She clicked her tongue and immediately Geronimo came to her and let her caress him. Mr. Brown looked at her in surprise. How did you do that, Bibi? It's very difficult to gain his trust. In Bibi's place, Freddie explained, it has to do with the fact that Bibi is a witch. It's the primal forces of nature, or something like that. Is it true? Are you a witch? I always thought there were no such thing as witches, said Mr. Brown. Well, I do exist, Bibi replied emphatically. You can't miss that, laughed Tom Brown, shaking his head. He wasn't the only one who wondered. Mrs. Martin also found Geronimo's sudden demeanor astonishing. Did you cast a spell on him, Bibi? She wanted to know. No, honestly, Bibi shook her head. Mrs. Martin was not convinced. Well, anyway, she turned to Mr. Brown again. Geronimo wasn't so trusting yesterday, but it seems he got used to his new surroundings surprisingly quickly, and at least he seems to have built some confidence in Bibi. Yes, that is indeed surprising, nodded Mr. Brown. But Geronimo is very intelligent. He must have realized that he's in good hands here, and maybe he has a special thing for witches. He smiled at Bibi. Can you tell us how you found Geronimo, Tom? Bibi asked. Yes, that must be an interesting story, said Tina's mother. We would love to hear it. Perhaps over a cup of coffee? Tom Brown immediately agreed to that. They went into the house, and Mrs. Martin brewed fresh coffee to serve with the remaining butter cake. The children were given hot cocoa. When everyone was settled and had made themselves comfortable around the kitchen table, Tom Brown began his story. He had grown up on a ranch in the state of Wyoming. Wyoming has always been cowboy and native country, he said. Even today, the Wild West can still be found there at every turn. Nature is pristine, and Mustang herds roamed the prairies as they did hundreds of years ago. Mr. Brown had been fascinated by these horses since he was a child, but eventually he left Wyoming to go study in New York City, where he had met his future wife. She had also come to New York from Redwell, to be precise, and was an exchange student at the same university as Mr. Brown. She loved horses and was an enthusiastic rider. During the vacations, they often visited his parents' farm, where Tom would show her the wilderness of Wyoming and the wild herds of mustangs. His girlfriend was as enthusiastic about these horses as he was, unlike many farmers in Wyoming. They were afraid that the herds of horses would eat the grass meant for their cattle. Because of this, many mustangs were caught by order of the government. For just a small amount of money, any American could adopt these animals, and since their fate had touched Tom's and his girlfriend's heart, they decided to save at least some of them. But how? They came up with the idea to open a ranch near Redwell and offer Western-style riding there, with real American mustangs. Now we live with many horses and our 3 children on our ranch, Little Wyoming, near Redwell, Mr. Brown finished. His eyes glowed with enthusiasm. Bibi and Tina sighed. What a romantic story. Freddie also murmured, impressed. Really cool, Tom. Tom Brown went on. It was a lot of work to set all this up, but it was worth it. When time permitted, he still visited his parents in Wyoming. During one of these visits, Mr. Brown had discovered Geronimo at a ranch for captive wild horses and bought him immediately. I had never seen a horse like Geronimo, he said animatedly. I just had to have him. Geronimo had been living at his parents' ranch for a while, and Mr. Brown had been trying to bond with him. Finally, he had him transported to Germany. But the long flight, the terrible storm, and the ride in the narrow transporter had confused the stallion so much that he had panicked along the way. Thank goodness you caught him again, said Mr. Brown, looking at the children one by one. But now it's your turn to tell us. How did you manage that? Bibi, Tina, and Freddie now reported how they had caught the wild mustang. Only last night's story they left out. You are real cowgirls and cowboys, exclaimed Mr. Brown. You must come to Little Wyoming soon and experience life on a Western ranch and Western riding. You can be my guests of honor. Wow, cried Bibi, Tina, and Freddie in surprise. They would definitely accept the offer someday. That much was certain. Let's say we go get Geronimo now, Tom Brown suggested jovially. You want to help me? Of course they wanted to. Even Mrs. Martin insisted on coming along. As they stepped outside shortly afterwards, they heard the clatter of an approaching vehicle. Who is that? Mrs. Martin wondered. But Bibi and Tina knew that sound. They looked at each other and shouted, The mill farmer! Vacation dreams come true. It was indeed the mill farmer who rattled into the yard on his yellow tractor. One could clearly see that he was loaded quite heavily. He got off his tractor and immediately approached Mrs. Martin, Mr. Brown, and the children. Hi, he barked. Well, this has gone too far. You can't rely on anything these days. This really is complete and utter... Outrage? Bibi interrupted him. Yes, that's what I wanted to say. The mill farmer scowled at Bibi, Tina, and Freddie and said, You promised to find the culprit, but what happened? Nothing. Instead of replying, Bibi, Tina, and Freddie just smiled at the mill farmer. What are you smiling at? He growled, expecting them to apologize or at least justify themselves. Tina shook her head disapprovingly. Really now, we're not grinning mockingly. Please know that. Exactly, Bibi affirmed. We smile at you with kindness. Besides, we've already caught the culprit. I'm sorry, but I don't understand, Mr. Brown said. Which culprit has been caught? Well, Geronimo, of course, Tina told him. She briefly reported that Geronimo had trampled the mill farmer's vegetable garden. I see, said Mr. Brown. But the mill farmer himself stood perplexed. Geronimo? He asked suspiciously. Who's that? Well, that was a famous Apache warrior, Freddie explained, inadvertently confusing the mill farmer even more. Apache? Apache? Native Americans? He stammered. Natives have my vegetable garden? Why don't you come with me? Tina asked him. They all followed in a small group to the paddock where Geronimo galloped about in high spirits. That's Geronimo, said Bibi, and pointed to the stallion. That's him? Marveled the mill farmer. He looked at the stallion with admiration. What a beautiful horse, he piped. The farmer's anger seemed to have subsided, and when he learned how Geronimo had come to Martin's farm, he apologized to Tina's mother. I'm sorry that I suspected your horses, Mrs. Martin." He raised his palms. "But how could I know that an American Mustang had trampled my garden?" At this remark, resounding laughter rang out from the others. A deep, heartfelt laughter, which the mill farmer couldn't help but join in. When Mr. Brown offered him compensation, the mill farmer was suddenly transformed into the most generous version of himself. "Oh no," he refused. "I cannot accept this over some tomatoes and pumpkins. The poor horse was just hungry." "How about I put your garden back in order, if Mrs. Martin doesn't mind?" Bibi suggested with a side glance at Tina's mother. She nodded with a smile. "Would you really do that?" asked the mill farmer. "Why didn't you say so?" "You could have asked nicely," replied Bibi. "It's often more effective than shouting." "Yes," the mill farmer lowered his head. "I must have acted like an old grump." "Yes, you did," Bibi laughed. "But I'll come by this afternoon and put things right anyway." With everything settled, Mr. Brown was ready to take the stallion with him. Geronimo followed him to the trailer, but then he stopped, danced back and forth, and snorted excitedly. He seemed to have bad memories of the vehicle. All Mr. Brown's coaxing didn't help, and even when he got into the trailer and tried to lure the horse with sugar cubes, Geronimo didn't budge. "Can I have a go, Tom?" Bibi asked. Mr. Brown nodded approvingly. Bibi joined Geronimo and stroked his forehead. The black horse calmed down immediately and lowered his head. Bibi nestled her cheek against his warm neck. "You'll be fine with Tom," she whispered. "There are meadows and pastures there where you can gallop around. You'll love it. Besides, I'll come and visit you very soon. I promise." Geronimo snorted. He still held his head down as if thinking about Bibi's words. Mr. Brown, who was waiting in the trailer, clicked his tongue softly. "Come, Geronimo. We're going home now, to Little Wyoming." All of a sudden, Geronimo raised his head. He entered the ramp with dignity and stepped into the trailer, where Mr. Brown stroked him for a while and talked to him calmly. Finally, he came out and closed the door. "Thank you, little Miss Magic," he said to Bibi. "I hope you really do come and visit us soon." And then he turned to all the others. "You're welcome on my ranch anytime." A loud, approving neigh rang out from the horse trailer, making everybody laugh. "There it is," Mr. Brown pointed his thumb over his shoulder. "Geronimo agrees with me." After he said goodbye to everyone, Tom Brown got back in the truck and rolled slowly out of the yard. Bibi, Tina, and Freddie ran after him for a few minutes and waved until the horse trailer with Geronimo disappeared behind a bend. When they came back to the farm, the mill farmer also said goodbye and rattled away, for once with a satisfied smile on his face. Mrs. Martin went back into the house to do some more work while the three children were standing undecidedly in the yard. Bibi suddenly felt quite strange. She was sad about Geronimo's departure, but at the same time happy that he had found a nice home. Tina felt exactly what was going on with her friend. She put her arm around Bibi and squeezed her. "We will visit Geronimo soon, Bibi." Bibi smiled. The very thought of this made her heart much lighter. "Tina, what I wanted to ask you," Freddie approached Tina. "How about we take a ride on my machine?" He had a smile on his face. "I just had it cleaned and oiled." Bibi chuckled when she heard this, wondering if Tina would be tempted by a freshly cleaned and oiled motorbike. Besides, Bibi suspected, since Tina had made up with Alex, she might not be so keen on going for a ride with Freddie. Well, Tina stuttered. Suddenly, they heard the distinct sound of hoofbeats and the three turned their heads. Who could that be? "Alex!" Tina cried in surprise. Alexander von Falkenstein came barreling through the gate on Maharaja. He swung out of the saddle and came towards her. "Hello, everybody. You didn't expect me, right? Has Mr. Brown come in yet?" "He just left with Geronimo," Bibi reported. "Ah, I'm sorry I missed him." But Geronimo is in good hands, Bibi summarized the most important news. "Besides, we can always visit him." "We'll tell you all about it later," Tina joined in. "But what are you doing here? I thought you had to supervise the roofing work today." "Well, I had a talk with my father this morning," Alex replied mysteriously. "A talk? Go on, tell me," urged Tina. "Well, I explained to him that as a future castle heir, I have to set my own priorities, and that today I want to spend the day with my girlfriend." He smiled at Tina, who then blushed softly. "You really said that? And he accepted that?" "Yes, he did," Alex nodded. So my father and I will take turns doing the roofing every other day, and the workers said this morning they could do it in 4 days. Oh, Alex, that's wonderful! Tina threw herself at her boyfriend. At that moment, Freddie suddenly had the uncomfortable feeling that he was no longer wanted. He somehow didn't think Tina Martin's bike ride was going to work out, but he had to admit that he had underestimated Alex. Freddie knew what a tough guy the Count of Falkenstein could be. "You really stood up to your old man," he hummed respectively. "That was cool of you." "Yes, I think so too." Tina looked up at her Alex, overjoyed. "Very cool." And he gently let her go. I brought you something, Tina," he said almost shyly, walking towards Maharaja. "What is it?" Bibi and Freddie also watched curiously as Alex opened his saddlebag and took out a red rose. "For me?" cried Tina, turning redder than the flower. "Where did you get that?" "Well, from the rose garden, of course," Alex said quite innocently. "Your father's rose garden?" Tina asked. Cutting off a rose there was a crime against the Count. Alex smiled and put his left index finger to his lips. "That's just between us, isn't it? My father doesn't need to know everything." With that, he presented Tina with the bloom. "Oh, that's beautiful, Alex." Tina gave him a loving look. When Freddie saw it, he shook his head and rolled his eyes. It was unbearable, he thought. That thing with the rose was just too corny. He had cleaned and oiled his bike especially for Tina, and then she made such a fuss about a rose. "What are we going to do now?" cried Alex happily. "I would suggest a horse race," Bibi and Tina said happily. "Want to come along?" Alex asked Freddie. He was serious about the offer, and he wasn't angry with Freddie anymore. But Freddie shook his head. "Thanks, some other time," he said. "I'd like to take a little ride on the bike now." Nodding to his friends, he said, "See you later," then got on his motorcycle, started the engine, and roared away. Freddie pushed the throttle faster. He was upset about Tina and couldn't deny it. "Girls," he thought fiercely, "they're like the weather. Sun today, rain tomorrow. Who gets them?" So he praised his little machine. It was running like a charm, and even more so today after some first-class maintenance. Suddenly, Freddie had an idea that immediately put him in high spirits again. He would try to set a new speed record on his favorite track in the gravel pit. Today was exactly the right day for it. Freddie had already forgotten the letdown with Tina Martin when he turned his bike around and hissed towards the gravel pit. Tina brought the rose to her room like a precious treasure. She put it in a vase on her bedside table and looked at it with delight. Alex was so sweet, she thought. He was already saddling Amadeus and Sabrina downstairs with Bibi. When Tina came out of the house shortly afterwards, the horses were ready to go. The three of them swung into the saddles and galloped happily out of the gate. The sun blazed warmly from the cloudless blue sky as the friends flew past a colorful array of autumn trees. "Come on, my sweetie," Bibi cheered Sabrina as the mare set off alongside the others. Bibi was overjoyed. It was just as she had imagined in her dream of the best vacation ever.